where does emotional eating become a eating disorder, and how do you get out of it again?
Yes, it's a very important topic, because I think that oftentimes this exact situation can actually lead us to even more negative thinking when we start judging ourselves for eating because of a feeling. So the first thing I want to say is we all emotionally eat, and it is 100% natural and normal because food is comforting. So we can definitely use food to celebrate. We can use food as a way to comfort us when we're feeling sad, 100%. And some of that is normal and totally fine, as long as it doesn't get out of control.
Together, we go out there, together, we begin to share.
Welcome back to another episode here on the Pulse. I'm Patricia Falco Beccalli, your host. And first of all, thank you to you, my community. We are growing strong. You're subscribing, you're liking. So thanks so much for watching all of these fantastic interviews that I try to bring you, share with you all along here on the Pulse. And today, I'm going to talk with Sue Van Raes, where she is what you may call a food therapist, food psychologist, a wellness expert, but definitely somebody you want to talk to when or when not you have some issues when it comes to food. Sue, thank you so much for joining us here on the Pulse.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Patricia. It is such an honor to be here with you. I'm so excited.
Sue, Food and Freedom is the first properly published book, properly because it's like going through a publisher. Discover your personal recipe to eat, think, and live well. First of all, let me ask you, why did you feel that food and freedom together, coupled together, is actually an issue you wanted to write about?
Oh, such a great question. So in my work, I see so many different kinds of people who are really experiencing food stress. And that can be to the extremes of what we would call disordered eating, or that could just be stress about how food's making them feel, stress about, the overwhelm and the overload of information that's coming at us from the media that's very contradictory. And a lot of people are feeling confused. A lot of people are feeling stressed. A lot of people are feeling like this aspect of daily life is really bringing them down, which makes me feel really sad, because as we all know, there's also the very beautiful, bountiful, pleasurable side of food that so many of us are missing when our food stress is high. And so I wanted to write about food and freedom, because when I feel stressed and bogged down in my own life, I don't feel free. I feel like the thoughts that are causing the stress are getting in the way of my happiness, and I'm losing luster when it comes to things that normally would bring me joy. And we've all had moments like that. But when it becomes chronic about food, what I've seen happen is that we are missing out on some of life's most precious moments because we're consumed with this sort of stress in our lives. Maybe it's about our bodies, maybe it's about what to eat, maybe it's about repairing old disordered patterns around food. And so it's really my mission to really help bring some healing and some joy and some pleasure back to the table for folks, because it really is an absolute possibility that food can be a source of energy, a source of strength, a source of healing, a source of joy and pleasure and connection. And I really hope that we can start to see that returning to people's lives in a way that is helpful and healing and an incredible gift. So food and freedom is really my contribution to that concern that so many people are experiencing.
I like the way you said, coming back to that food is pleasure again, or something that gives us energy, because that is really what food is. It's an energy source for us to live. And I wonder, zooming out a little bit, Sue, where did food stop being pleasurable and start becoming painful for our society, or even in an individual's life. If I think about babies, they don't have food stress. They get stressed if they're hungry. And then the mother gets stressed because she knows she needs to feed. So where in a lifetime, or where in societal development did food become a painful issue, a stressful issue, rather than just something normal you have to do as sustenance?
Yes, it's interesting. I don't know if there's a specific exact time frame, but just the other day, it's interesting that you asked this question. Just the other day, I was talking to one of my clients, and she said, before we finish up today, I just want to ask you, what can I say to my daughter who's 11, who is in the grocery store with me the other day and said, Mommy, I think I'm fat. And I froze. My client said, I froze. I didn't know what to say, but I saw her little brain in this question about her body and about food. And I didn't want to say the wrong thing. So I waited and I kind of, brushed it off in the most gentle way I could until I could talk to you to get some suggestions. And while that's not the case for everyone, of course, we all have different experiences around food and our families and the belief systems that come along with different households and different ways of being. I see that this type of thing in young children is starting to emerge younger and younger. And there is so many sources of that. Whether this particular 11-year-old heard it on a television commercial, or learned it from a friend at school, or saw something on her, mom's computer or phone, what have you, there's so much food focus and body focus in the world that is leaving us feeling very confused about which is the right path. And a lot of those externalized approaches to both body image and to different kinds of diet culture, to different kinds of eating styles, it's trending in different patterns at different times in our lives. And we'll watch and see how things change just by looking at different timeframes over the past, few decades. We can even see big trends emerging around food and body, and including the fact that even body size trends. And that to me just is insane, because we're constantly trying to match ourselves up with these impossible models for eating and for how we look. And it is absolutely bringing us down as a society. When I heard that about this young 11-year-old little girl in the grocery store, that was just a few days ago, my heart got so heavy. But then I'm thinking, yes, this is why I wrote Food and Freedom, to help people get an idea that we can turn inward to our own bodies, to listen to what our bodies need, rather than looking externally or outside of ourselves for answers that may or may not even be a good fit for us in the big picture. In fact, most of the time, they're not a good fit for us, because they are taking us out of the most important aspect of our internal wisdom. So we start learning to override our bodies at such a young age. And then the snowball, starts getting bigger and bigger. And by the time we start to look at it in a way that we want to repair or heal, there may be decades of this type of thinking and this type of struggling. And it just becomes, we have to go back and untangle so many different layers. I'm here for that. I'm here to help people untangle the layers, but I'd surely love to stop that snowball from even beginning at a really young age for so many young kids. So there's definitely many examples of that. I'm sure you have yours as well. And it's something that just really saddens me as a person when I see that.
It is saddening. I mean, the latest statistics for our interview, I looked up the latest statistics on obesity, Sue, and I was really surprised. And it's talking about adolescents, as you mentioned, that 11-year-old girl. I mean, the rate of obesity in adolescence since 1990 has quadrupled 4 times. And I think it is an exponential increase. Social media hugely influencing that development, apart from, of course, all these diets, how or how not you should eat in order to look a certain way. But you mentioned something I would like to pick up on, and also kind of put it together with your own story journey with food, and that was, you know, the family belief, the paradigms, and also the food traditions one grows up with, because that is hugely important, hugely influential on one hand. On the other hand, if I imagine the story you just were telling us about a mother being surprised that her child at 11 would see herself as big or fat, or would ask if she was, her being surprised at that question means that that family belief of maybe being totally okay about food did not transpire too much, influence that child too much. Where do you see the balance? What sort of role did food play in your family, and why is food now more or less something that you do on a daily basis?
And I love talking about this because I actually have a really pleasurable experience for the most part around food, as my family, you know, kind of showed me growing up. We often had family dinners together. We definitely had big meals over the holidays and had lots of people gather. And my mom would set the table like 3 days before Christmas because she was so excited with her very special dishes that she only pulled out a couple times a year. There was a lot of really good food culture. For me, what happened was I was born in the 70s and grew up in the 70s and 80s. And there was a very big trend at the time that was basically carbs for breakfast. Sugary carbs for breakfast. They're starting to be less of that now with a bit more knowledge. But during that time, I mean, it was absolutely normal to have Lucky Charms or sugary cereals and things like that for breakfast. So, of course, my mom, she would kind of nip that in the bud by not buying the very sugary cereals like Lucky Charms, but she would buy the healthier cereals like, you know, Cheerios or something like that. But regardless, I was extremely sensitive to sugar. And so eating that way in the beginning of the day set me up for a very challenging roller coaster of blood sugar all day long. I was also a competitive gymnast my entire childhood, so that also exacerbated my symptoms of hypoglycemia, which was undiagnosed until I was in my 30s. And it's so interesting because during that time in my childhood, I was just doing what everyone else was doing. I was doing what my siblings were doing. I was doing what my friends were doing. We were all just eating cereal for breakfast. It doesn't sound that detrimental. But for me, because of my severe hypoglycemia, it was absolutely giving me this major spike and crash repetitively throughout the day, which left me feeling very, very hungry and undernourished. I was like shaky a lot. I was definitely always wanting something. Like food became this thing that I just seemed like I couldn't get enough of. And at the same time, you know, going through my calories on a kind of heightened level, being a competitive gymnast exacerbated the symptoms. And so I really found that because of these symptoms of exacerbated hunger and low blood sugar, you know, food was always top of mind. It just left me thinking about food all the time because my body was wanting food. And so what happened was I started to get interested in cooking, and I started to get interested in meal prepping with my parents, who were both actually really great cooks. And it just became, food just was always so central in my life. And so when I went back to school after my undergraduate degree to get my master's in nutrition, it was actually like it became like a very obvious choice because food had been so front and center for me. And I was trying to figure out how to solve my own food issues and how to feel satiated, which at the time felt like it was almost impossible for me. So it really brought me along this journey that now I love to share with others. And I'm so grateful for all that I've learned about my blood sugar and my metabolism over the years, because now My blood sugar is rock solid. It doesn't crash very often unless there's some extenuating circumstances. And I really have learned to feed my body in my own unique way. And that is keeping me in balance throughout the day. And that's what I teach other people, is how to create balance for themselves, which might look really different than me, but learning about our metabolic health and our blood sugar stability has been foundational in my business, 100%.
Yes, I think it is. First of all, thank you so much for that openness and sharing that story. I find it very, very interesting. I have similar kind of features. For me, it was not gymnast. For me, it was classical ballet. So there was a lot of body awareness, pressure of being a certain shape and light for the pas de deux, etc. So you know the entire spiel. So one becomes extremely aware of one's own body very early on in life, maybe sometimes even pre-puberty, which is very damaging in the long run as well, not only psychologically. But coming back to what you just said at the end, you know, your metabolic health and the mental health is extremely interlinked. And having that roller coaster, that glucose roller coaster, I don't know if you wear a CGM, what you think about, you know, the entire insulin, blood sugar spiel, the Ozempic that has been, you know, so much introduced into our society, where I feel it's going the wrong direction. I love metrics. I measure my body, you know, being a biohacker left, right, and center. However, does it really solve the issue of what you were saying, to find your own food balance and be level?
Well, for me, I was experiencing a lot of these symptoms for so many years, and I knew they didn't feel good. And I started to learn that what was happening, but I didn't actually know how severe it was happening until I did do a trial for a month with a CGM. And I was testing so many different foods. I actually had planned to test some foods that I knew were not good for me. But then as I got closer to like my plan, I started thinking like, I don't want to do that. I don't want to eat a chocolate bar or something that's going to make me feel crappy the rest of the day. So I stuck with pretty much my regular diet. And there was a couple of little snafus that happened, of course, in 30 days. One was so funny. It was simply, I went to the coffee shop to get a chai. And I always order an unsweetened chai so that I can, you know, add my own sweetener, or if any at all. And they were out of unsweetened. And I was like, oh, well, I don't know what to do. I've already waited in line for 5 or 7 minutes. You know, the woman at the coffee shop said, oh, this one isn't that sweet. You know, our ginger chai is really not that sweet. And I was like, okay, I'll try that. So I drank a regular chai for the first time in a long time. And I could not believe how much that one beverage impacted my blood sugar in 20 minutes. My blood sugar was through the roof. And I was just like, wow, okay. And there was another time where I forgot to add the protein powder to my morning smoothie. I was driving up to the mountains with my partner, and we were kind of rushing to get out the door, and I was bringing the smoothie in the car, and I forgot to add the protein powder. It was literally sitting on the counter. So I didn't realize I didn't add it until I started to notice, after an hour and a half drive to the mountains, my blood sugar dropping and dropping. I'm like, what's wrong? Like, I don't ever feel like this when I have these particular smoothies for breakfast. And sure enough, we got up to the mountain cabin. I checked my blood sugar. It was way, way low, like in the 60s. And I was like, wow, this is the feeling I had when I was a kid. This crashing feeling that was really pretty intense. Luckily, we had some protein snacks that I could reach for, like some nuts and some yogurt and things like that. But it was just through these little mistakes in wearing the CGM that I really got to witness some of the symptoms that had been with me for so long and actually see what was happening. So I think that, yes, we can get obsessed with tracking. We can get obsessed with anything in our culture, right? But it is a really helpful tool to see what's happening in real time with our blood sugar. Most people would be surprised at how dramatic these responses are. And one of my clients, actually, who was on a very, very big journey with her health and weight and diabetes, and lost over 200 pounds and reversed her type 2 diabetes. And I did actually interview her on my podcast way back a few years ago. And I asked her, what were the most important pieces that you would tell others to consider from your journey of such an elaborate success story? And what she said was the CGM had really shown her exactly what was going on in her body, and that she was still using it because she was wanting to ensure that she knew what was happening and not letting anything slip back into old patterns. And the second thing that she mentioned was reading ingredient lists and really getting clarity on the amount of carbs and sugars primarily in processed food, that once you start looking and your eyes open to the truth of sometimes what we're putting in our bodies, it's incredibly astonishing that these foods are out there and they're way out of balance. I was looking at a protein bar at the store the other day, and it was like 5 times more carbs than protein, with such a little amount of protein in there. And it's all in this marketing that we get so allured by. And if we don't do a little bit of the deeper research by just simply reading the ingredient lists, we're missing the mark and we're not aware of how food is impacting our bodies. So finding the middle ground, for me, a 30-day trial worked great because I got to witness different things that I do in my day-to-day life with the CGM, and that was incredibly helpful. And also now when I have these sensations in my body that come with high blood sugar or low blood sugar, I now have like a little bit more of a name for them and a number for them, instead of being, wondering what's actually happening. So if we can look at it as a gathering of information, but not an obsessing about information, I believe that there's some really good work we can do as far as our health goes in that way. For
Yeah,
sure.
no, I'm totally with you there. So I'm wearing my CGM now, I think about 4 months. I love it. And I'm just thinking, okay, I need to wean myself off because kind of I know what's going on, and but it astounds me, and I watch what's happening in my body also during sleep, like after a carb day, for example, or you just had a party, how long it really takes the body to go, you have the sugar, you've got the insulin, you've got the sugar back, you've got the insulin, and somehow in the middle of the night, you kind of level out in your fasting blood glucose. And it is, I just feel really guilty when I do that, and then I see how hard my body is working to get it right again.
Exactly. I mean, sometimes it's like, it's amazing to see like what our poor little bodies go through sometimes.
Well, we put them through. Exactly. And talk about in your book also about when your mind bullies your body. We'll talk about that a little later. But let's talk about a really interesting concept. I think a lot of people kind of say en passant, but really don't know what it all means. And that is, I raised my daughter Victoria with a line: crap food, crap mood. Okay, just to make the whole thing very simple for a child. But what it actually means is that what we ingest really impacts our nervous system, the production of our neurotransmitters, which then very much shapes how we feel, how we think, and subsequently how we behave. I mean, we become different people according to what we eat. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. This is like one of my favorite topics. Food 100% can impact how we feel later in the day, whether that be an hour later or a few hours later. And really, because our metabolism and the foundation of our metabolism really being our blood sugar is the starting point, insulin, often called the mother hormone, because it really creates a domino effect to all other hormones in our body, including our reproductive hormones. And then, as you mentioned, our brain chemistry, there is a very important relationship between our brain chemistry and our blood sugar. In fact, I like to say that our brain chemistry mimics our blood sugar. And so just like the kid's birthday party, we see the spike, everyone's very happy and kind of high on sugar. And that lasts for not that long, but a little bit. And then how many times, most parents out there can attest to this, I for sure can, as those kids' blood sugar crashes in the birthday party, one by one, they have meltdowns. And how many times have we had to carry our kids out of young kid birthday parties crying or having a meltdown? We are experiencing the same thing. Maybe we've learned not to have a meltdown in public, maybe not, but maybe. And we are witnessing our bodies go through these changes where we might feel one emotion primarily, and then we'll notice another emotion take over. And especially anxiety, especially just happiness and joy coming from serotonin. When we are way out of whack with our metabolisms, our brain chemistry is going to create more of these challenging sensations in our body, which also are going to relate to how we're thinking in the ways in which our brain chemistry is either working for us or not working for us. And so it might feel fun in the moment to spike our blood sugar and spike our serotonin and dopamine, but it is very short term, and it followed by the crash, which is when we start to feel crappy. And so just like what you said, like the crappy food or the crappy combination of what we're eating leads to the crappy mood. So we can absolutely eat to feel how we want to feel. And that is power. That's personal power. That's agency over ourselves. That's choice. Really, that's freedom. But we have to learn what that looks like for each of us. And so if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I don't know how to eat to feel how I want to feel. Well, I can tell you how in the book, of course, but also it's being a detective in our own bodies and learning things that we might learn from a CGM, or we might learn from getting our blood work done, or we might notice within our mood and our brain chemistry throughout the day. There was a client of mine that was just with me for one session and started eating protein for breakfast. And the next time I met with her, just a couple weeks later, she had already noticed a major shift of her mood throughout the day. And that was the only thing she changed. And I was like so excited that these small tweaks can literally make such a huge impact on our quality of life. And so, yes, food can make us feel good. Food can make us feel crappy. And the more that we learn what that looks like for our individual selves, the more we're going to create the life that we want to live from the ground up, from the inside out.
Yeah. And there's so many questions that come to my mind in what you said, because food is so much more than just food. Okay. And food creates, as we just said, certain feelings and emotions. On the other hand, because we have certain emotions, we sometimes turn to food, called emotional eating. And it is so funny because one of the scientists I read up on, he said, well, because we have a deficiency in feel-good hormones on a day-to-day basis, running or rushing through our lives, we are lacking serotonin, we are lacking oxytocin, we are lacking, we're lacking even that dopamine, that motivational hormone. Sometimes if you have a numb life, you have like a numb life. And so you look for a mood shifter. It can be alcohol, it can be drugs, it can be food. Right? And this and this emotional eating. Talk to us about this one, because this is emotional eating. Is that already an eating disorder, or is that something that we all do because, when we were little and something happened and mommy just said, oh, come on, just let's have a pie and let's forget about it. And you had the pie and you had a huggle and whatever with your mom and everything was okay again. Where does emotional eating become a eating disorder, and how do you get out of it again?
Yes, it's a very important topic, because I think that oftentimes this exact situation can actually lead us to even more negative thinking when we start judging ourselves for eating because of a feeling. So the first thing I want to say is we all emotionally eat. And it is 100% natural and normal, because food is comforting. So we can definitely use food to celebrate. We can use food as a way to comfort us when we're feeling sad, 100%. And some of that is normal and totally fine, as long as it doesn't get out of control. When we are avoiding feeling our feelings, food can absolutely numb us. And sometimes, a little bit of time needs to pass for us to be willing to feel whatever's going on in our bodies and in our lives. And that can be daunting for people, especially because we have primarily been taught to override our feelings and to kind of push them down and repress them. And as we start to practice feeling our feelings, which I just want to say for me and how I teach, is by actually just going into the physical sensations that feelings cultivate inside of our bodies, we can start to process our feelings a little bit more in real time, rather than repress, and eat our feelings. So there is a distinction between what would be normal emotional eating that is just inherent in eating at all, because we can all say that eating is comforting and pleasurable at times. That's how it literally is happening in our bodies. Food tastes good, it smells good, it looks good. But when we become really out of balance around our emotions and around the places that we feel like we don't have the ability to really give ourselves the space, or even if we haven't even necessarily considered it an option because it's so ingrained in us to avoid these negative emotions, then we start to get out of control with emotional eating or comfort eating, where it is basically become an addiction, or the only option that we have in our lives, where we might feel like it's the only way we know how to regulate our nervous systems, where we feel like it's the thing we do when we get bored or when we get tired and overwhelmed and we don't have the energy to do other things that might be longer lasting and more impactful as far as digesting our days. So what happens is it becomes the only option, or the option that gets way out of control by quantity or by frequency. So when we start to notice this lack of self-control, really, which also can lead to many different other feelings of shame or guilt, then we might have gone from what would be like a normalized emotional eating experience to an exacerbated or disordered version of emotional eating, and sometimes even binging. So we most often will turn to this with highly palatable foods, sugary foods, foods that are high in fat, foods that are high in refined carbohydrates. We very rarely see or hear of people overeating or binging on wild-caught salmon or on strawberries. We most often hear of people binging or eating to exacerbation with foods that are going to be more made in a way that is through excitotoxins that are more addictive and that help us to kind of boost our dopamine levels really quickly, or more processed foods that have, a lot of these extra additives and preservatives. The ultra processed foods that are full of excitotoxins really throw off our dopamine receptors. And so it really becomes a kind of like a can't get off the wheel, because the food is helping us to get through these challenging emotions. And it's also throwing our brain chemistry out of whack, which is making those challenging emotions occur more often. And so I believe that if we are noticing ourselves in an exacerbated response around emotional eating, that we might want to pause for a moment and just look at where things are out of balance in our lives. Are we unhappy in our jobs? Are we unhappy in our relationships? Are we under fulfilled in the things that we're doing? Are we overloaded with work? Are we overextended? Are we not tending to our boundaries around what we're doing throughout the days and how much we're taking on? Is there a stress in our lives that we would rather not deal with? And when we start to look at emotional eating, even as, like I like to call it, a teacher, we can start to unearth some of the other things that are going on that are much deeper than the overeating or the emotional eating or the binging, and start to look there for where we can do repair that might have nothing to do with food at all.
And can we do
So
that by ourselves? Can we do that by ourselves, Sue, or do we need a professional like yourself?
I think there's a pretty long spectrum. And I think if we get to the very extremes of the spectrum, where we really feel like we've lost control, where we really feel like our coping skills are damaging ourselves, and where we feel like we don't have the ability to make a shift on our own, then 100% we need support. 100% we need feedback. 100% we need accountability. We might need deeper emotional work through that different kinds of therapy to help us learn the ways that we can create more support for ourselves on our own down the road. But we all know that, like, when things are really falling apart, it's really hard for us to see clearly our own lives. It's so much more helpful to have someone there supporting, holding space, guiding us, giving us feedback, being an accountability source, and giving us some new tools to work with that are going to make a big difference.
Here, the challenge, it seems that, food you need every single day. If you are a drug addict, cocaine addict, you don't need cocaine to live. So kind of like going cold turkey and never turning to that drug again is not going to challenge your livelihood. Whereas food, you need to eat every day. So you're being basically exposed every day to something that is a huge challenge to you, which of course makes the relationship and also the healing of whatever eating disorder you may have developed harder, because you're working on your eating disorder, needing to eat every single day, exposing yourself to that potential problem. What I thought was very interesting is like the trajectory you if I get it right, you explained. So food is so much more than food. Food is, yes, nutrition. It's physiological, but it's also psychological. You have a good time, you share a meal together, you're in love with somebody, or on a family feast, a party, whatever. And that's great. On the other hand, sometimes because you feel numb, you turn to something that stimulates you. Food is very stimulating, as you were saying. You've got the dopamine, it gives you the sugar high, you feel charged, you feel great, not for very long. And then you have a physiological drop, right? Which then the psychological numbness, it is not helping that either. And then at that moment, to really start becoming mindful, which I think you meant perhaps by the word pause. And I had Dr. Judd Brewer also on the show talking about mindful eating, to then dissociate whilst you're kind of like next to you. You can observe yourself eating crap and you can't help yourself, to then really have that pause. That is incredibly difficult. That is incredibly, strong for anybody being like in the midst of that binging experience. I mean, do you know what I'm trying to ask? Is it's one almost feeds the other, the one, and eating disorders are just terrible.
It's so true.
Huh?
It's so true. And it kind of goes right back to where we started. So when we are eating in a way that isn't supporting our system, whether that be our blood sugar, our metabolism, the various things that we're doing, and we're noticing then an exacerbated issues with our brain chemistry, our mood, and how we feel, and then we're turning to food again to repeat the process, to comfort eat and do all the things that we do there. It takes a moment of recognizing that we're on this hamster wheel that we cannot get off of. But that recognizing is incredibly powerful and incredibly potent, because once we've made that recognition, then we can start on a journey to get the support we need. That moment of recognition, even if that's all there is, even if the pause is barely possible, or if we are so overloaded or consumed by our habits around food that we have no particular way that we know of in how to stop the behavior, recognizing it will give us at least, it's like planting the seed. It's like planting the seed so that then we can hopefully keep coming back to, like, I've made this recognition. I know this is not a healthy pattern for me. I know that I'm hurting myself in the ways that I'm managing my emotions with food. And where can I get support? Now, if you have an ability to stop and pause and to create space between impulse and action, then that's gold. Like, that is literally priceless, because that ability to pause and make a conscious decision about your next action or intention in that space literally can create the beginning of the shift. But sometimes it's just happening so automatically, and we're so immersed in a behavior and we're so used to doing it that we aren't even creating the space to notice or to do something different, because it's just happening without even us really paying attention. Part of the problem is that most of us are rushing through the day. Most of us have way too much going on. Our society is so productivity focused and busyness focused that for so many of us, even just giving ourselves some downtime to be able to process the day is fleeting. And I think that is very much part of the root of the problem. We haven't been given the tools. And where we learn those tools, sure, like lots of different spiritual traditions have tools like that. Lots of different therapeutic models have tools that are incredible. But if we haven't been exposed to that sort of thing in our lives, we might really have no idea even where to start. So that recognition is so incredibly important, just to notice the behavior, just to become the witness in your life and start to take like an eagle-eye view and see what you're doing. And is what you're doing leading you closer to what you want for yourself in the big picture? Or is it actually moving you out further and further away from what it is that you want? And there you can start to have that beginnings of a conversation with yourself or with someone else, in that recognizing that things are not matched up in alignment with how you want them to be.
Yeah, and also maybe where it comes from. And I'm wondering about traumas, because we talked slightly about parenting as well. How do you parent your children into healthy eating, which I would just say normal eating, how we used to eat? How much does trauma really play into what you in your book call also when the mind bullies the body? Where you've had experiences as a child, you were talking about yours, that we really carry for decades without really knowing it, that is our trigger. All of a sudden, that something happened in your childhood that changed the relationship to food. For the first time, you might have become aware that you're actually eating a lot or not a lot, or more sugary rather than more fatty foods and whatever, because somebody made a comment or because you saw something on social media or something. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's so important, this conversation, this question, because so many people are struggling and suffering. And I really love Dr. Gabor Mate's quote that goes like, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. And so what's happening is we have a residue of whatever sensation and experience has happened in our pasts in our nervous systems. And the nervous system responses that we're experiencing are overwhelming in a lot of cases. So we might go into a fight response, which is going to be more adrenaline. We might go into a flight response, which is going to also include those stress hormones that are giving us the energy to flee. We might go into a freeze response, which is giving us this time where we are feeling paralyzed around our next move or our next choice, or we feel like we don't know how to get out of that sort of stuckness in our bodies. We might go into a collapse response where we feel like we just give up and we are hopeless. No matter where we fall on the spectrum, whether it be sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, stress responses, what is happening is food comes in as a way to regulate ourselves. And, for somebody who's stuck in a freeze response, food actually helps us come out of the freeze response because it's giving us flavor and sensation and an experience that kind of wakes us back up again. Or if we're in a fight response or a flee response, we might notice our appetite shut down for a period of time, but that doesn't mean that our bodies are not hungry. So when the hunger comes back on board, and this has happened to me before, when the hunger comes back on board, it's big. It can be big because we've been calorie deprived during the time that we were triggered in the nervous system. And that might be a day or an hour, but that also could be weeks if we're going through a really stressful time. I remember a time where I was going through a really stressful time for about a month, going through something with one of my kids. And my appetite shut down for weeks. Like and I knew what was happening because of all the studying that I do. And, this was, far along in my career. So I knew what was happening in my body. And even with knowing what was happening in my body, I would go to eat food, like force feed myself. And I would actually end up spitting it out. Like I could not swallow the food. Like my body was like, no, you do not need food when you're in this high adrenaline stress place. Because if you were truly running away from the grizzly bear, you're not supposed to get hungry. You're supposed to use all of your energy to flee or to fight. And so it was really enlightening for me to experience that so deeply and so clearly, but also knowing what was happening in my body. And man, it took me a few weeks to get back to normal. And when I did, the hunger that came back was fairly huge. I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm so hungry all the time. But, I had my calorie intake had gotten so low during those few weeks of stress. And so our systems are really trying to help us. Our nervous systems are trying to keep us safe. And with that comes the dysregulation that impacts either whether we're not eating enough or whether we're eating too much. And using food to regulate ourselves works, but it is not the way to heal trauma. It works for the short term, but it will not go into the deeper layers that are actually there looking for support and healing and repair. And so when we really can learn about how our nervous systems are responding to our trauma, then we can start to understand what's going on in our bodies a bit more and understand whether, food is actually going to come in as a way that is going to either support or exacerbate what we're going through. But trauma is absolutely related to our relationship with food, and especially to disordered eating behaviors that so many folks experience. And it is a coping skill. And it is a coping skill that has worked enough to get you through the trauma. There is a time where that coping skill can either both start to become a disservice to you, right, over time, and also it can basically kind of highlight where you need to do some deeper work. And when you're ready to release the coping skill, because it's no longer serving you or it's expired, I believe that rather than shaming ourselves around that, which is so common, What if we were to actually just stop and say, like, thank you for getting me through that really hard time. But I'm now good on my own. Like, I don't need that Band-Aid anymore. And so it's not like it's a horrible thing when we have to get through something challenging that we lean on food. It's, does it continue to serve way beyond its time when it's expired?
No, thank you so much for this very in-depth explanation. And it makes me think of, you basically during that stressful time, you really listened to your body. Okay, so you didn't override the impulse of that aversion there and then. You were so high on adrenaline, you were constantly either, fighting or feeling, I don't know what was happening there, but your body needed to focus on that. And it I guess, released sugar. So if you had the CGM, you would have had, sugar, I guess, in your body because of the cortisol in your body, and the whole mix in the blood to just release energy without even needing the food. And that you then had to go back and maybe get the calories back in is another issue. But I think the powerful story behind that story is that you actually followed what your body needed there and then. And that's something I think also often is lost in today's society. We don't listen to our bodies. We do what we think we should be doing or we have to do because we're in a certain social context or within social pressures. Sue, let me quickly touch on a couple of other issues, because we have this conversation where I think some of our listeners also think, so what should I eat? Okay, we all know processed food is not so good. We all know too much sugar, too much salt, too many preservatives, all the chemicals is not good. But if you had to say, well, listen, to keep level in terms of also your neurology and just being a little bit more, away from the roller coaster that we tend to get, and gets us the stress, gets us anxious about food. How big is the role of protein? You mentioned it before. How big is the role of the right fats? There was always the fat scare. I also grew up in the 70s and 80s. Oh my God, you were not supposed to even spell the word fat because it was like a sin back then. Or eggs. My God, how can you eat eggs? Are you crazy? So if you had to give a little bit more on the physiological side, a bit of a rule or tendency, what does do us good on a neurological and psychological level?
I just would like to say that if we can move closer to foods in their whole form in our diet, we're going to get so much more medicinal potency and all the nutrients we need to feel like we are at our best. I mean, natural food has these incredible phytonutrients and these incredible macronutrients that are all needed in our body to be at optimal health. So we obviously have a very strong food culture of ultra processed food that is, available everywhere. And the more we can avoid that and turn to things that are in their natural form, the better. But as far as staying stable in our blood sugar and really feeding our metabolisms well, even though we're all unique and we all need slightly different ratios and different, kind of templates for this within our own eating, there's some universals that I think are really helpful. And that is, if you can get all three macronutrients, protein, healthy fats, and like good quality carbohydrates at every meal, along with a lot of micronutrients or phytonutrients, which are like your non-starchy vegetables, then you're setting yourself up so much more for success. If you start skipping macros, then you're going to notice either your blood sugar's off, or you don't have enough energy throughout the day, or you're getting hungry quicker and things like that. So creating a plate of food that has balance, that has color, that has lots of natural ingredients, lots of plants, lots of vegetables, healthy fruits that are rich in color, is going to get you on the right foot there, as well as ensuring that you're getting some source of protein, some kind of healthy fat at every meal, because both protein and fat elongate the blood sugar curve. lower the glycemic index of a meal, and help you to stay satiated longer and in balance longer. So it's not that carbs are the enemy, it's that carbs by themselves have a blood sugar impact. And the more highly processed carbs have a bigger blood sugar impact. And so that's why we want to dial down on the processed carbs and come back to more whole carbohydrates like blueberries or sweet potatoes or, steel cut oatmeal, whatever it is, and pair it well with those other proteins and fats so that it is not throwing your blood sugar into a tailspin.
Yeah, they always say dress up your carbs, right?
Exactly.
Exactly, dress up your carbs. And the other thing is, of course, the balance between the body acidity and how alkaline it is very, very much also impacting on how we react. When we are acidic inside, we are acid outside. I mean, we are snappy, we are not nice. And you can just tell that somebody says, hey, you want to eat a bread roll. Too many proteins. But I think this is very, very interesting what you're saying. And I think that the right fats, and there have been many studies out there for kids, for example, ADHD, where they started feeding them omega-3s, MCT oils, and all of a sudden, their blood sugar was more level, or their level of concentration went up. And there are so many interesting things, but the food industry makes it very difficult for kids especially to be weaned off. They should never get on it because it's literally sugar being a drug, and the food composition, the food engineering is so wonderful, so palatable that you're hooked after one spoon of whatever Lucky Charms forever and a day. And that is really difficult. And I live in Europe, I live in Switzerland. One thing we do not necessarily have, what I find when I travel in America, is sometimes makes it really difficult for me, are food deserts. America has food deserts where, you cannot, unless you eat the grass somewhere on the roadside, you do not get anything that is unprocessed. And I find myself always traveling with my food, as ridiculous as it is, as there is no Whole Foods, at every corner in smaller cities. And that is also very difficult, I think, in terms of society. And I'd like to kind of start winding down our conversation, our wonderful conversation, Sue. I'd like to know from, your point of view, where are we going in our society when it comes to our, food behavior? I look at the statistics. I mentioned the adolescent statistic just earlier on, but the World Health Organization expects by 2035 that 51% of the world's population is either going to be overweight or obese, meaning BMI above 25 or 30. And that will mean, because of sickness due to this physical condition, we lose about $4 trillion yearly, or 4% of global GDP, in basically productivity of people. So where are we going right now if you have to observe society? And juxtapose that with the trend of these GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic, which is really is not a fad. It works. It's expensive, but it makes cheating so easy. You eat your cookies and all the crap, and you inject, and everything seems to be fine. For how long is the question. But give us a bit of a trend where you see society going with the food behavior right now.
Thank you. Yes. I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's twofold. I see health and wellness also trending. So I think that health and wellness is making its way into the mainstream more than ever, which is incredible. So there is that awareness happening. But at the same time, there is the food desert kind of mentality where it's really hard to get healthy whole foods, and processed food is cheaper and easier to get our hands on. It's quicker. It involves less prep time. All those things that are so alluring when it comes to what we're going to have for dinner or what we're going to have for a snack. We don't necessarily want to have to go and prepare something that's going to take 30 minutes when we can grab something really quick. So we are kind of stuck in, a little bit of that thinking when it comes to eating. I see drugs like Ozempic coming in a way that could be very useful for certain people who have really challenging situations happening with their ghrelin and leptin levels, which are the hunger and fullness hormones that are way off balance. And I've listened to some really crazy, interesting testimonials, even from really young kids who were experiencing such severe food issues and weight gain at such young ages that, you know, there was like Ozempic or something similar would come in and really, really help these kids have a normal childhood. And in that case, there's benefit because clearly there's something going on an internal hormonal level that may be really hard to repair with just some of the normal ways that we would see helping others when things are that exacerbated. I believe that if we could give people who need help the drug, if they need it, even for a short term, but also the education they need to pair with that on how to feed their bodies well, we would be in much better shape than just giving people a drug and then watching them continue on the unhealthy behavior that they've had, which had created the problem in the first place. So if there was a way to pair that sort of nutritional counseling or therapy with people's drug use in that way, I think we would see much better results. But as far as, you know, people who are just taking that for their own reasons that may not actually be because of having severe imbalances, but rather are wanting just to lose some weight or wanting to not have to deal with the repercussions of what they're eating, then I think we have a bigger problem. And then I think that we also need to start looking at like what's going on in the messaging in our culture that is giving us that desire to go to these extremes that may not actually be good for us long term, and that surely are not actually dealing with the problem at hand. So I really see that there's such an interesting conversation going on about Ozempic and drugs like Ozempic right now. And I think it's super confusing for people, but I also don't want to go to the extreme of saying that it's all bad, because the people who really need that drug to come back to some kind of normalcy within their system and within their lives are incredibly grateful for the opportunity to do that. And so we've really got to look at all sides of the equation in this way. But of course, getting long-term studies and clinical trials that have more long-term data into our hands is incredibly important, because with these new types of drugs, we just don't have all of the information in front of us.
I think you're so spot on. You know, if there's a pathology behind it and you can use Ozempic, for example, or drugs alike, that's great. If it is for vanity, it's questionable. In terms of backtesting, a lot of those people that actually really, proponents of that drug, they say, well, it's been used for diabetics for the last 30 years, and that's all there is. And at the end of the day, you're injecting insulin. I just thought that I wanted to ask you, because I think it does not only squeeze away whatever there is in the blood, but it messes with our minds, full stop. When you start messing with your hormones, you mess with your entire holistic system, because we are a system, and that is a long-term risk that I may see for that. So, food and freedom. If you had to put the 3 key messages out there of your book, you want your readers, potential readers, to come across, to know, what are the 3 key messages there?
So the first thing that comes to mind is that we don't prioritize our relationship to self in this world. Most of us are prioritizing all the other people in our lives, all the other aspects of our lives, but we're neglecting to focus on the most important relationship, which is our relationship to self. And that includes how we feed and nourish our bodies. So if we can just consider prioritizing our relationship to self and food just as high as everyone else in our life, if not higher, but at least as high, right there, we're already making progress towards something that can make a shift or create the space for the support that we need going forward. The other thing that I find that I would love to just kind of put out there into the world, as another big point around the mission I have, is what would it be like if we started to turn to the most sacred language of our bodies, which is sensation, to start to understand what it is we're needing and wanting on a deeper level instead of externalizing everything. We are constantly looking outside for the answers. We're not finding them, that's for sure, but we haven't necessarily, as a collective, turned inward. And I don't mean into like some kind of psychic knowing or intuition that feels like way abstract for people, which is fine if that works for you. And I have zero problem with that. But I think oftentimes we are taught that if we're not supposed to look externally, then we're supposed to be intuitive. And being intuitive when we don't know what we're being intuitive for or towards is like literally like talking, Swahili to someone when they don't understand what we mean, right? Like it's just completely hard to grasp. But the work that I teach around listening to the sensations of our body, our hunger cues, our satiation cues, the different kinds of wise cravings that our bodies have, can be, with a little practice, the most informative aspect of our eating and living, and also reliable because it's happening here where we know that we can build self-trust around listening to those cues. So that's one of the other messages that I think is so important to, kind of leave people with, that around the book, Food and Freedom. And then the third would be, if we start to find our way into biochemical balance through our metabolic health, through our blood sugar, through the different quality of food that we're eating, everything else gets easier. Like our mood gets easier. The inner critic quiets. We have more agency within our feelings. We have more emotional resiliency. We're stronger. We're more powerful. We're more embodied. We have more to give. We feel brighter and more vibrant. We are lighter in our spirit. Like everything starts working better. We're moving into the flow of life instead of going against the flow, kind of swimming upstream in life, which makes things so much harder. So if you can remember that when you are biochemically imbalanced, that you are creating more ease for yourself in the big picture, hopefully that will provide some inspiration for creating some healthy change.
I love that. I love that. Let me just summarize that. So you started with self-love, just feed yourself first in more than one way. The other one, interoception, so your own sensation, listen into you, and not just in the Buddhist Zen way, but really just be aware of what's going on inside, despite so much going on outside. And the other one is the biochemical balance. So really here we're going into the neurology of things, how food really impacts our body chemistry. And if our body chemistry works well, we work well. I always say to my daughter Victoria, so what happens? Imagine you're a Ferrari, and in that Ferrari, instead of high octane petrol, you put in a can of Coke. Is it gonna be winning the race? Is it gonna be losing the race? The answer is obvious. So such a pleasure to have you here on the show. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for being a food psychologist, therapist. I think you will have a very long career and you should train a lot of people. To end this podcast, just let everybody know, where can they find you? Where can they be, together with you? Satiate is your podcast. Tell us a little bit where people can find you on the various platforms.
Absolutely. So everything that I do is really housed under Boulder Nutrition, which is my company. And the website is bouldernutrition.com. And that's after the town of Boulder. So it's BOULDER, Boulder Nutrition. And then I'm at Boulder Nutrition on Instagram. I have a free offering for folks that's called Make Peace with Your Plate, 5 daily practices to cultivate food and body freedom. That's on my website. It's like a little ebook guide. So you're welcome to grab that if you want to head over to the free tab on the website. There's lots of good stuff there, lots of articles I've written, lots of recipes that you can check out. My podcast is there. if you want to listen, it'll show you all the different places you can listen to it and click over. So really, bouldernutrition.com is your best bet. And then I love to post on Instagram, and I love to create some fun giveaways and some fun experiences over there when I can. So at Boulder Nutrition on Instagram is another great place to check out my work.
Fantastic. And there are many, many interviews with you where you really go into also the ins and outs of the book you just released about a month ago, Food and Freedom, Discover Your Personal Recipe to Eat, Think, and Live Well. Super, Raes, thank you so much for being here with us here on The Pulse.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Such a pleasure to be with you today.
And thank you, my dear, on the Pulse community. I hope you really like this conversation. I loved every single piece of information. I love Sue's work. I think it's fundamental. It makes me triste that we have to do this kind of work in today's society when it comes to food and all the disorders around it. But there you go. I'm sure you took a lot away from this conversation. Make sure to subscribe, to give us a like, and be with us for the next conversation here on The Pulse. See you then.
Together, we go out there together. We begin to share together. We find our way.